Well, hello there. I didn't see you come in. Make yourself at home. Have a drink. While I give some attention to some underappreciated characters and storylines that I personally love. And I hope you grow to love as well.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Today we are reading Swamp Thing number 136. And just a little catch up on what's been going on. Swamp Thing and Abby have been having marital problems because Swamp Thing lied to her, so Abby has left the swamp and is now moved to New Orleans with Chester, leaving Tefe, her daughter, and Swamp Thing in Houma, Louisiana, along with Lady Jane, who is their nanny. And in the last issue, we saw Swamp Thing try to kind of get back with her and apologize, but she wasn't having any of it because he hurt her so bad. So he finally realized, an apology is not going to fix this. And our relationship might actually be over. So once that realization hit him, he got very sad. He sat down on a log and he took root. He just kind of shut down and his consciousness retreated into the green. We also saw Abby and Swamp Thing have some new love interests. So there's a guy named Don who's one of Constantine's friends who met Abby and now they're kind of flirting with each other. And while Swamp Thing was retreated into the green with his consciousness, Lady Jane decided to go in there with him. So in the real world, her body just kind of began to grow roots into him as his husk was sitting there on a stump. But inside the green, she was making romantic moves on him. And he was responding. And we were left with Lady Jane and Swamp Thing's consciousnesses inside the green intertwining. And then in the background of all of this, we have seen the resurrection of Anton Arcane in the body of General Sunderland. And in the last issue, we saw him begin to start to make his unmen again, starting with Dr. Polygon as his first test subject. And that is everything that was covered in the last issue. So first things first with issue 136, we got the cover here. We see some ethereal versions of Swamp Thing and Lady Jane. He is green, she is yellow. They are embracing each other and intertwining, and they look like they're about to get pretty intimate. And we also see on the cover that this is written by Nancy Collins with art by Russell Braun and Kim DeMolder. And we start off on the first page where we left on the last page with Lady Jane and Swamp Thing's consciousnesses embracing in the green. And Lady Jane's consciousness is, like I said in the last issue, a naked human version of herself. And Swamp Thing's consciousness version of himself is like it was before he had his change a couple issues ago where his body transformed into the 90s grunge Swamp Thing. So Swamp Thing and Lady Jane embrace. Swamp Thing is thinking, it was so different with Abby. Not better, not worse, just different. My only other frame of reference when it came to the act of love was Linda Holland, ghost memories stolen from the mind of a dead man. But for all practical purposes, I was a virgin before Abby, except for a strange, involuntary interlude with an alien organism during my exile from Earth years ago. I have been with no other until now. And that's a deep cut right there about the alien involuntary interlude. That is talking about where Swamp Thing was in space during the Alan Moore run, and a spaceship raped Swamp Thing, and yeah. That happened, and that was issue number 60 if you want to go back and listen to that. So in these panels under the narration, we're just seeing them initially just hugging and embracing, and then Swamp Thing and her begin to make out, and their faces kind of meld together. And it's not just their faces, because as we turn the page, we see that their bodies are beginning to sprout roots and vines and stuff, and also intertwine with each other that way. And Swamp Thing's narration continues. Strange. It's just now occurred to me, this is the first time in my life I've made love to my own kind. And we see the name of this issue is Pollination. Then we see Lady Jane kind of pull away from him and look into Swamp Thing's eyes, so now their faces are not melded together. And as Swamp Thing stares at her, his narration says, she appears before me, green and soft and inviting, offering comfort and shelter in her bower. I see in her a great wisdom. She is the Madonna, the keeper of mysteries, and she answers to many names. Ceres, Titania, Demeter, Isis, Mary. And as Swamp Thing says all these legendary names of, powerful women, in Swamp Thing's eyes, she's turning into each one of them as he says their name. So really building up Lady Jane here as a strong, powerful woman. And maybe that's how like Swamp Thing is justifying this. So Lady Jane's body begins to float backwards from Swamp Thing, and her chest rips open and reveals a green light inside with, I guess, her essence. And it's pretty obvious that this is a metaphor for her vagina because the narration says, "She opens herself to me, and I am not worthy, but I still enter." And then the same thing happens to Swamp Thing where his chest bursts open and then his essence comes out and begins to intertwine with her essence that is coming out of her chest. So we got two green essences intertwining in between Swamp Thing and Lady Jane's hovering bodies. And Swamp Thing's narration continues. To describe what happens next between us in the limited terminology of human sexual experience beggars what truly transpires. But I once believed myself a man, and old habits are hard to break. I never knew it could be this good. And under this last line, the panel is showing the intertwining of the two green essences of Swamp Thing and Lady Jane. So apparently she is rocking his world like it's never been rocked before. So all that has been taking place inside the green. And as we cut to reality, like what's happening in the real world, we see Swamp Thing is just, rooted into the ground, into the stump. Lady Jane is rooted into him and the ground next to him. And Tefe is just sitting in front of them, not knowing what to do. I mean, keep in mind, Tefe is like 3 years old. So they've left a toddler by herself in a swamp with like alligators and other animals that could hurt her. Not to mention just standing bodies of water where she could drown easily. But luckily, Tefe is a pretty smart girl. So as she sits there looking at them and they're not moving, she gets bored. She goes back into the house that I guess Lady Jane had kind of rebuilt a little bit of after it was destroyed by the flower monster Thunder Petal. And luckily, Lady Jane also stored cookies in there, I guess, or maybe the cookies just didn't get hurt during the collapse of the house. But either way, Tefe gets a chair and stands on top of it to reach a jar of cookies that is on a shelf. And then she, has fun time eating cookies, and she gets some crayons and begins to draw. And we see she's looking out the window at Swamp Thing and Lady Jane, and she's drawing a picture of them. And when she's done with the picture, she goes back outside and tries to get the attention of Swamp Thing to show him the picture, saying, "Daddy, drew you picture, Daddy." And when she holds the picture out to him, of course, his body is just like a husk now because him and Lady Jane are inside the green. So, of course, he doesn't respond, and all she sees is just, black holes where his eyes should be. And then she walks over to Lady Jane, and she says, "Lady, read me a story." But Lady Jane as well does not move because she is also rooted and is in the green currently. And then we see her get super sad and begin to cry as she looks down at the picture. And the picture she drew is of Swamp Thing fighting Thunder Petal. And as she cries, she drops it to the ground and then sits down and begins to cry even harder. And as she's crying, we see a shadow come up from behind her and someone says, "Tefe." And as she turns around to see who's behind her, we don't see who said that, and we cut away to New Orleans with Abby, and she is talking to Carl as she brushes her hair. And if you don't remember, Carl is the friend of Chester, who originally lived with Chester in his house before the KKK ran them out of town. And then they have what I think is a condo that they've purchased that has an attic space, and that attic is where Chester is living and also where Abby is staying at the moment. And when I say attic, it doesn't look anything like an attic. It just looks like another apartment above Carl's apartment. So as Abby's brushing her hair, it looks like she's having a pretty hard time of it. And she says, "Ow, damn it. That's the third snarl I've hit already. I'm going to be late. I just know it." And Carl says, "Relax, Abby. You're working yourself into a lather." And then Abby pauses for a second and says, "You don't understand, Carl. This is my first date in years. Come to think of it, it may be the only proper date I've ever had." And Carl's a little confused by this, and he says, "I can see how you and Alec might have not had a standard courtship, but weren't you married before?" And as Abby puts on some earrings, she says, "My relationship with Matt, my first husband, was hardly normal, even compared to what I've gone through with Alec. Matt and I met under rather peculiar circumstances, to say the least. We didn't really go out as such. It was more like we just kept finding ourselves in dramatic situations as Matt pursued Alec, who he believed to be a monster at the time, across the globe. We'd been together for years, and after all we'd gone through, it seemed only natural that we should just get married." And then she thinks for a moment about Matt, and she says, "Poor Matt. So under all this narration, we're getting like different scenes from the original Swamp Thing run, where we see her from her first appearance in issue 2 of Swamp Thing, where Matt Cable and her meet for the first time. And then we also see a scene from issue 7, where Swamp Thing is in Gotham with Batman, and they're trying to find Abby and Matt as an evil scientist electrocutes them for the evil organization known as the Conclave. And I did do episodes for those, so if you want to go back all the way to Swamp Thing Volume 1, it is issues 2 and 7 that you want to check out there. So Abby continues to explain to Carl why she's so nervous, and she says, "So even though I'm a healthy 30-something woman with 2 marriages to my credit, I hardly have any practical experience when it comes to dating do's and don'ts, and I'm scared half out of my wits." And Carl replies, "I know how you feel. Bill and I had been together for a long, long time. After I realized he was no longer alive, the very idea of meeting anyone new was enough to paralyze me. If it hadn't been for Troy being so understanding, being willing to meet me halfway, I might never have gotten over my fear of personal involvement." And just as he says that, he gets cut off by the doorbell. And at hearing that, Abby begins to freak and says, "Oh God, there he is. Carl, answer the door and tell him I'm sick. Tell him I have the Black Plague, dropsy, scrofula, anything." And Carl just kind of smiles at this and gets her jacket and puts it around her shoulders and nudges her to the door saying, "Oh no, you don't. You're not getting out of this that easy." But even though Carl is nudging her to the door, he is the one who answers. And as he does, he sees Dawn, who has flowers for Abby, and he says, "Hi, you must be Dawn. Abby was just telling me how much she's looking forward to your evening out together." And Abby quickly interrupts that by walking in between Carl and Dawn. And then as she's walking out with Dawn, she turns to Carl and angrily whispers to him, "Thanks a lot," because she's embarrassed about what he said to Dawn. Then we cut to a restaurant called the Commander's Palace in New Orleans. We see Dawn and Abby sitting at a table and they're drinking wine together. And Dawn is saying to her, "I highly recommend the turtle bisque. It's exquisite." And as Abby looks at the menu, she says, "Dawn, are you sure you can afford this?" And Dawn looks at her and says, "Abby, I assure you, neither of us will be stuck washing dishes to pay for this meal." And Abby kind of smiles to herself and says, "Well, in that case..." But then she's interrupted by someone saying, "Excuse me, ma'am, you're Abigail Arcane, are you not?" And as Abby looks up at the man, she sees it is a reporter, and he has a tape recorder and a microphone pointed at her. And he continues saying, "It's rumored that you are involved in the disappearance and possible homicide of Representative Benjamin Barron. What do you have to say regarding these allegations?" And Abby's just kind of taken by surprise and dumbstruck, so she's saying, I... But then a very angry Dawn cuts in and begins to yell at the man saying, "What is the meaning of this?" But before he gets an answer, 2 very large men who kind of look like bouncers in tuxedos kick this reporter out of the restaurant. And as they do, the reporter is yelling back to Abby, "Miss Cable, do you have any explanation concerning the unprecedented vegetable freakout that occurred a few days ago? Is it true your husband, the so-called Swamp Thing, is responsible?" And then we see the manager of the restaurant going up to Dawn and saying, "My most abject apologies, Mr. Raynard. I have no idea how such a person managed to get inside the restaurant." And Dawn looks pretty angry, of course, because his date is now potentially ruined with Abby. So he walks over to her and he says, "I'm sorry that had to happen, Abby. Are you all right? I don't know how a nutcase like that got inside." But of course, this has all brought forward thoughts of Swamp Thing and their relationship to Abby. So she looks kind of sad and she turns to him and says, "Take me home." And Dawn's kind of confused by this and he says, "Huh? But we haven't ordered yet." And with a little more force, she says, "Please, Dawn, just take me home." Then we see them walking out of the restaurant and it's pouring rain, of course, just to make their date even better. And then they get into Dawn's car and he says to her, "Not that it's any of my business, but what the hell happened back there?" And she replies, "I'm sorry, Dawn. I should have told you about my husband from the start, but I was afraid you'd, well, get frightened off. Do you remember last year during the governor's election? For a while there was a joke candidate that people started taking seriously, at least seriously enough that it got on the news?" And Dawn answers, "I was out of the country when that was going on, although I remember hearing something about it. Wasn't there some kind of swamp monster involved?" And Abby says, "It was Swamp Thing, not a monster. And he just happened to be my husband." And we get this great panel of Abby looking out the side window as she says that, and then Dawn looking straight ahead as he's driving, and he looks very worried as he says, "Oh, Then we cut back to Swamp Thing and Lady Jane inside the green, and they are having a grand old time making loves, and Swamp Thing's narration says, "We chase one another through the green, like the children of nature we are, playing hide and seek with the whole world as our playground. Trinidad, Vietnam, Greece, France, as we flit from jungle to desert, from rice paddies to tundra, it is almost enough to make me forget my troubles. Almost, but not quite." So we see in these panels that as Lady Jane and Swamp Thing are, playfully making love and playing hide and seek, they are appearing in each one of these countries at different times as they find each other, I guess, and they will grow bodies momentarily from the local plant life, intertwine, and embrace each other. And we see like the locals of those areas are watching this, like, what the hell's going on with our crops? Then we cut back to Abby and Dawn in Dawn's car as he pulls up to her apartment, and Dawn is saying, "I'm sorry our evening was ruined before it had a chance to begin." And Abby replies, "It's not your fault, Dawn." And Dawn says, "I promise I'll make it up to you next time." And then Abby kind of smiles and says, "Yeah, next time." And then Dawn goes in for a kiss and she follows suit. And as their lips are about to touch, all of a sudden someone knocks on the driver's side window. And as Dawn rolls it down, he sees that there is a police officer standing there and he's saying, "Are you Abigail Arcane Cable?" And Abby immediately starts to get out of the car and says, "What's going on, officer?" And as she does this, Dawn says to her, "Abby, stay in the car. I'll handle this." But before Dawn can do anything, the cop slaps his handcuffs on Abby and he says, "Miss Cable, you are under arrest as an accomplice to the first-degree murder of Benjamin Barron and for failure to comply with the family court of the state of Louisiana concerning the surrender of your daughter Tefe to the proper authorities." But as the policeman is talking, we see that Abby is kind of looking over his shoulder and she says, "What?" And then we see what she was saying what about, because as the cop reads her Miranda rights, some creepy hands come out of the darkness and grab the police officer by the head and snaps his neck. And then this giant humanoid monster grabs Abby and she screams, of course, and Dawn sees this and he yells, "Abby!" And we get a good look in this panel of what the monster looks like, and it's a humanoid monster. It is naked and it has all gray skin. His entire body is hairless and it has a humanoid face, but it has really, really long limbs like arms and legs. And its legs are shaped like frog's legs, so it looks like it can jump. And this monster turns and smiles at Dawn, and then it takes off running down an alleyway towards a green delivery truck that just happens to be waiting there. And we see a cloaked figure say, "Hurry up, you imbecile." And Dawn tries to follow. He takes off down the alley as well. But unfortunately, he gets there too late, and the green delivery truck drives off. Then we cut to the inside of the back of that truck, and we get a shot of Abby looking at someone. We don't see them. And she says, "Who the hell are you?" Then we see the cloak figure pull his hood back to reveal the new face of Dr. Polygon. And it basically looks like something from Hellraiser, where his face is in the middle, his normal face, but it looks all contorted. And his face is basically just made up of stretched skin, because around where his skull would be are the heads of multiple different peoples that have been grafted or fused into his skull. And also his skin is purple. And as he pulls back his hood, he says to Abby, "I regret the unorthodox manner in which you were contacted, Miss Holland. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Polygon." And Abby, of course, who's never met Dr. Polygon, doesn't know who he is. And she says, What do you want with me?" And Polygon replies, "I don't want anything from you, Miss Holland. I was just doing what I was told. It's your uncle who wishes to see you." And she looks horrified by this revelation. And then we cut to John Constantine, who is at a topless bar, and he is at the side of the stage, and he's looking at the topless woman in front of him, who's kind of leaning towards him, and he's saying, "Nice," I guess about her tits. But his leering is interrupted as Dawn comes in and says, "There you are." And as John turns around, he looks kind of annoyed, and then he sees what Dawn looks like, and he's all disheveled, he's all wet, his hair is totally soaked and all messy, his tie is undone, his shirt is untucked, and John exclaims, "Struth, man, what's wrong?" And in case you don't know what struth means, it is a British word that basically just means you are surprised. So a very frantic Dawn goes over to John and says, "They took her, snatched her right in front of me." And John says to him, "Hold on, old son. Back up a bit and start from the top. Who's got who?" And Dawn replies, "Abby! They've got Abby! don't just sit there. We've got to do something. And then John stands up and buttons his trench coat and he says, damn right, we've got to do something. And Don asks, where are we going? And then John lights a cigarette and says, we're going to take a bloody field trip. Tell me, Reynard, ever visit the swamps of this charming backwater you call home? Then we cut to John and Don walking through the swamps. And Don is looking pretty freaked out. He's looking around all scared and he says, why did we have to wait until morning to try to find this guy? Abby was kidnapped hours ago. They must be hundreds of miles away by now. And John replies, look, mate, I'm not about to go wandering through these bleeding swamps in the dead of night. I'm not too keen on the idea of walking into a nest of frickin' alligators out in the middle of nowhere. And if we can't locate the bog god, we'll be shit out of luck. Then we cut to John and Don reaching the clearing in the approximate area of where Swamp Thing's house is. And John looks around and says, stately Swamp Thing Manor should be hereabouts if I remember correctly. And as he's looking around, he notices two trees that weren't there before. And these are gigantic trees. And one of them is like a grayish green and the other is a brownish yellow. And they are intertwined with each other. And when I say they're gigantic, I mean hundreds of feet tall. So John begins to look up the trees and he sees the tops of them look like two faces that are meshed together kissing. And John smiles and says, I'll be buggered. That cheeky monkey. Because obviously these two trees are actually what the husks of Swamp Thing and Lady Jane have grown into during their sexual escapades. So John walks over to the grayish green trunk and he knocks on it and says, break it up, lover boy. You've got company. And then something next to John begins to sprout and grow in the ground. And Swamp Thing appears in his new 90s grunge body again. And he says to John, what do you want this time, Constantine? And John kind of smiles to himself and says, I hate to interrupt, but I've got some information you might be interested in. There again, maybe not, seeing how you're busy boinking the nanny and all. And then he gives a once over to Swamp Thing's new body and he says, by the way, I like what you did with your hair. Very world beat. And Swamp Thing, who wants to get back to making love, says, get to the point. And finally, Don just kind of blurts out, Abby's been kidnapped. And I guess because John has disturbed them, Lady Jane also leaves the green and grows her own body next to Swamp Thing. And it seems like maybe she's trying to call him back into the green to continue. And she says, Prime Founder, as she grabs his arm. And Swamp Thing's not paying attention to her now. With extreme worry on his face, he looks at Don and says, what? And Don continues, she was grabbed by some weird-looking guys last night and taken away in a van. And Swamp Thing asks, this van, did you get a good look at it? And Don replies, yeah, enough to tell it belonged to the Sunderland Corporation. Does that help? And then a very worried Swamp Thing says, yes, it does. And then he begins to think, Sunderland, of course. Having nearly destroyed me by mistake, they now deliberately turn on those I hold dear. I should be grateful. At least this isn't Arcane's work. We can also see in the background that Lady Jane has moved a little bit farther away back from Swamp Thing, and she kind of looks like she's been spurned. And then John comments to Swamp Thing, that's not the half of it, bog god. Apparently there's an arrest warrant out for both you and the missus for the murder of that snotty-nosed Nazi bastard Baron. And to top it all off, they're under orders to take your little Miss Sunshine away and make her the ward of the court. Speaking of which, where is the little rugrat? And finally, Swamp Thing and Lady Jane realize Tefe. Where the hell is Tefe? We totally forgot about her while we were making love. So they begin to search around for her, saying her name. And keep in mind, the last time we saw Tefe, she was being talked to by some shadowy figure we did not see as she was crying in front of the husks of Lady Jane and Swamp Thing, who were not responding to her. So after looking around for a little while, Lady Jane finds her and says to Swamp Thing, Prime Founder, here she is. And then she pushes aside a bush, and we see Tefe is there, in fact, and she's drawing on some paper. And Lady Jane says, she's perfectly fine. And as Swamp Thing approaches and sees her, he says, Tefe, come to Daddy. And he bends down to pick her up, and as he does, she turns to him and says, Daddy? And Swamp Thing's face looks horrified, and then everybody else gathers around, and they look horrified, and Constantine even says, bloody hell. And then we see what they're looking at, and Tefe's face has changed. She now has green eyes, and she has a wisp of green in her white hair. And now instead of like a regular human nose on her face, she has like the nose bridge thing that Swamp Thing has, except she still has her nostrils. So there's two little nose holes poking out from the new ridge formation on her face. And she brings up the picture and shows Swamp Thing and says, look, drew you a picture, Daddy. And the picture is not of Swamp Thing or anything. It's actually of a Raggedy Ann doll and then a couple different types of animals. Looks like a dog and a cat. And I will fill you in on what's going on here after we finish the end of this episode, because it's a little weird how she just transforms randomly. So then we cut to the Sunderland corporate headquarters in Washington, D.C., and we see Abby is tied up in a chair that's in the middle of a laboratory. And she's just waking up from being knocked out, so she's saying, Alec? And then someone says off panel, "Ah, Sleeping Beauty awakes at last." And as Abby comes to more, she says, "What? What's going on here? Who are you?" And as she looks up, we see there's a bunch of lights behind this shadowy figure, which puts him in silhouette so we can't see his face. And he says, "Come now, my dear. Surely you must have guessed by now." And then a look of recognition comes onto her face and she says, "Wait a minute. I know that voice. General Sunderland? But that's impossible. You're dead." And then he gets really close to her and he brushes the hair out of her face and he says, "I'm more than dead, my dear. Much more than that." And as he kind of caresses the hair out of her face, she jerks her head back to get away from him and she says, "What the hell do you want from me, Sunderland?" And Sunderland replies, "You hurt my feelings, sweetheart. Is it so unusual for one such as myself to wish to spend time with members of his family?" And Abby says, "What are you getting at, you crazy old man? I'm no relation to..." And then she understands and she says, "Oh no." And then we turn the page and we get a full splash of Sunderland smiling evilly, and half of his face is the deformed monster face of Anton Arcane. And he says, "Oh yes." And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. But before we end, I'm going to fill you in on what happened to Tefe, because this literally comes out of nowhere if you're reading it after the fact like we are, or during the time if you did not pick up the crossover series called The Children's Crusade. And this was a crossover book that spanned all of the Vertigo titles, and specifically their annuals for that year. They all made a story about the children of these certain books getting pulled into some kind of fairy tale land called Free Country. And Free Country is a place where children never go old and are free from the tyranny and abuse of adults. And if you're interested in actually collecting this or reading it, there is a collection, but it's a redone version that doesn't include all the issues from these annuals. So if you actually want to go back and read this in its original form, you have to go back and get the issues. And those issues are Children's Crusade #1, Black Orchid Annual #1, Animal Man Annual #1, Swamp Thing Annual #7, Doom Patrol Annual #2, Arcana Annual #1, and Children Crusades #2. And if you read all those, that is the original story as it was intended and made. But like I said, you can actually buy a collection of them, but it has been rewritten by Neil Gaiman, I believe, and a couple other authors. So that's a bit weird to me, but that's what they decided to release as the collection of that story. So the reason why Tefe looks different at the end of this issue is because Tefe is taken to this land called Free Country. And at first she's having a fun time playing with all these other kids. She gets along with Maxine Baker, who is Animal Man's daughter, really well, and kind of makes friends with her. But of course, this is not all fun and games. There is actually like a big bad inside of this world. And in Swamp Thing Annual #7, which I read just for this explanation because it doesn't really pertain to the Swamp Thing story, Tefe in her original body ends up fighting this big bad. She has a power-up where she releases a very large amount of energy in order to defeat this bad guy. And when she does that, her body has a small transformation from the power that was used from the green, and this causes her face to look more like Swamp Thing's. So that is what happened. I have not read the whole Children's Crusade story arc, but like I said, if you want to check it out, you can find those issues, or you can read the collection of the redone version that's a more cohesive version of the story according to, the writers and DC. So I will leave you with that. So if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains&comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And remember, until next time, stay swampy.